When Vampire King Draven Nightfall returned to Castle Noctis that evening, he expected his fortress to be shrouded in its usual deathly quiet. What he found instead nearly shattered centuries of composed restraint. His maid, Adriana Charles, stood beside his daughter Princess Lilith in the heart of the royal study, calmly teaching her royal etiquette through forbidden gestures. The dying sunlight pierced through the cathedral windows of the marble castle, casting crimson and gold across the polished obsidian floors. Draven's boots whispered across the stone as he approached the study's arched entrance, then stopped. There, at the center of the room, stood Adriana in her simple servant's dress, moving with the grace of a courtier, as she gestured elegantly before a parchment scroll labeled Royal Gestures. Lilith sat at the ancient oak table, completely entranced, mimicking the signs with a radiance that lit her pale features like moonlight, breaking through storm clouds. Adriana held up her hands. Demonstrating the gesture for honor, Lilith repeated it, then smiled, a soundless burst of joy so rare it sent a shock through Draven's immortal heart. Gratitude, respect, loyalty. Each gesture unfolded like a small resurrection. The same child who had remained hollow and unreachable since her mother's death was now expressive, present, alive. Thank you for joining me in this dark tale, my cherished readers. If you're already captivated and ready to descend deeper into the shadows of Castle Noctis, follow along and let me know in the comments where you're reading from, because tomorrow I'll be bringing you another story just as haunting as this one. And you won't want to miss it. Draven's chest constricted, an unfamiliar sensation for a creature without a beating heart. He'd summoned the finest tutors from across the vampire territories, scholars who'd served kings for millennia. None of them had brought light to his daughter's eyes like this. Something felt wrong. Too intimate, too effective. He stepped into the doorway, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. What is the meaning of this? Lilith flinched, her small hands freezing mid-gesture. Adriana turned slowly, her expression calm, almost serene, but not subservient. Not afraid. I was helping the princess with her comprehension, Your Majesty, she said evenly. She was struggling to understand the histories, so I used visual demonstration to help her process the material. Her tone was respectful, but her eyes held something else. Intelligence, restraint, and an unshakable presence that no mere servant should possess. Draven's gaze narrowed, crimson irises flashing in the dimming light. You were hired to maintain this castle, not to educate my heir. Adriana nodded once, silent, and began to gather the scrolls with practiced care. But the precision of her movements caught his attention. The way she rolled each parchment, the systematic organization of the gesture charts, the confident handling of materials she had no business knowing how to create. This wasn't improvised. This was trained. She collected the materials with the methodical efficiency of a scholar, not a housemaid. Every motion is deliberate, academic, almost noble. Draven watched in silence, an unfamiliar discomfort coiling in his chest like smoke. That night, long after Lilith had been escorted to her chambers, Draven couldn't find rest. The way Adriana had taught, the way Lilith had responded, it gnawed at him like a splinter in his mind. He stood before the enchanted mirror in his study, replaying the scene again and again through the castle's ancient scrying magic. The silent exchange between servant and princess felt like watching a memory from another lifetime, one he'd buried with his wife. He summoned his steward with a single gesture. I want a full investigation of Adriana. Charles, he commanded, voice low and lethal. Her history, her education, her bloodline, everything. What Draven didn't know, not yet, was that Adriana Charles had never existed before 3 years ago, and what he was about to uncover would not only dismantle the carefully crafted lie she'd been living, but threaten to expose the fragile foundation of his entire kingdom. The morning after the confrontation, Castle Noctis stood silent once more, but it was a different kind of silence, the kind that hummed with secrets waiting to crack open. Draven sat alone in the throne room, his fingers drumming against the armrest carved from ancient bone, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. He had ordered a full investigation into Adriana Charles. It would take days, perhaps longer if she'd been careful. In the meantime, he would watch. And what he would soon discover would lead him down a path he hadn't walked since the night his queen had died. A path paved with forbidden knowledge, hidden identities, and a truth that could either save his daughter or condemn them all. The throne room of Castle Noctis had witnessed countless executions over the centuries. Tonight, the guards expected another. Adriana Charles was summoned at midnight, the hour when vampire justice was traditionally dispensed. 2 armored sentries escorted her through corridors lit only by flickering torchlight, their boots echoing against stone like a funeral march. Courtiers lined the walls, their pale faces hungry for spectacle. whispering behind jeweled fans about the audacity of a human servant who dared breach royal protocol. At the far end of the chamber, King Draven Nightfall sat upon his throne, a monument of black marble veined with silver, crowned with the skulls of ancient enemies. Candles surrounded him in concentric circles, their flames casting his sharp features in shadow and gold. His crimson eyes burned through the darkness like coals. Adriana was brought before him and released. The guards stepped back, hands resting on sword hilts. She knelt, not with trembling limbs or bowed head, but with composed grace, back straight, chin level, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression remained serene, almost peaceful, as though she knelt in prayer rather than judgment. The murmurs died. Even the flames seemed to still. Draven leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the silence like winter wind. "Do you understand why you've been summoned?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Then you know the penalty for defying a royal decree?" "I do." Her tone was steady. No pleading, no excuses. The guards exchanged glances. Most humans brought before the king wept or begged. This one simply waited. Draven's fingers tightened on the armrest. "Explain yourself. You were given explicit instructions when you entered my service. No one is to teach my daughter. No one is to fill her head with false hopes or broken promises. Yet you created those scrolls. You instructed her in gestures I specifically forbade." His voice dropped, lethal and soft. "Why?" Adriana lifted her gaze to meet his. A dangerous act for any servant. But her eyes held no defiance, only quiet conviction. "Because, Your Majesty, a princess who cannot speak still deserves to be heard." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the chamber. Draven's jaw clenched. "You overstep." "Perhaps," Adriana acknowledged. "But silence imposed is not the same as silence chosen. Your daughter does not lack a voice. She simply lacks a language you recognize." A sharp intake of breath echoed from the courtiers. To speak so directly to the king was to invite death. Draven rose slowly from his throne, descending the dais steps with predatory grace. He stopped mere feet from where Adriana knelt, towering over her like a shadow-given form. "You dare lecture me about my own child?" "No, Your Majesty." Adriana's voice remained calm, unwavering. "I dare only to offer her what every child deserves, the ability to express what lives inside her heart. She is brilliant, creative, full of questions and wonder, but without a way to speak. All of that remains locked away, unseen." She paused, then added softly, "As her mother would have wanted." Draven's hand shot out, gripping the edge of his throne as though to steady himself. The mention of Seraphine, his late queen, sent a bolt of pain through his chest. "You know nothing of what my wife wanted," he growled. "I know she believed in bridges, not walls," Adriana replied gently. "I know she saw strength in what others called weakness. And I know she would not want her daughter to live in a prison of silence simply because the world refuses to learn her language." For a long moment, Draven said nothing. Conflicting emotions warred across his face, fury at the insolence, admiration for the courage, and beneath it all, a deep, aching pain he'd buried with his wife's body. He turned away sharply, pacing toward the window where moonlight spilled across the stone floor. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost dangerous in its restraint. "Your methods. Where did you learn them?" "I studied linguistics and communication, Your Majesty, before I came into your service. A servant with scholarly training." His tone was laced with suspicion. "Convenient." Adriana said nothing. Draven turned back to her, eyes narrowing. "You hide something. I can taste deception like blood on the air." "I hide nothing that concerns my loyalty to this house, Your Majesty." "Then why risk your life for a child you barely know?" Adriana's composure finally cracked, just slightly. Her voice softened, tinged with something almost like sorrow. "Because I know what it means to be unheard, and I refuse to let another soul suffer that fate if I can prevent it." The throne room fell silent again. Even the guards seemed to hold their breath. Draven studied her, this strange, fearless woman who knelt before certain death with the calm of a saint. Every instinct screamed that she was more than she appeared, but beneath his suspicion, something else stirred. Curiosity, recognition, and the faintest ember of hope he'd thought long extinguished. Finally, he spoke. "You will be confined to the East Tower. You are forbidden from seeing my daughter, or leaving your quarters without escort." He paused, crimson eyes boring into hers. "But you will not be executed." "Not yet," Adriana bowed her head. "As you command, Your Majesty." The guards moved forward to escort her away, but Draven raised a hand, stopping them. "One more thing." His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "If you truly care for my daughter's well-being, pray you are not lying to me." Adriana met his gaze one final time. "I am many things, Your Majesty, but I am not a liar." She was led away into shadow. That night, Draven stood alone in the corridor outside Lilith's chambers. hidden by the enchantments woven into the castle walls. Through the cracked door, he watched his daughter sit at her small writing desk, candlelight illuminating her pale hair like a halo. She was practicing. Her small hands moved through the gestures Adriana had taught her, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Honor, gratitude, love, each motion deliberate, purposeful, alive with meaning. Dreven's breath caught. For the first time since Seraphine's death, his daughter was not hollow. She was not lost, she was becoming, and the woman responsible was locked in a tower, awaiting judgment. Draven closed his eyes, centuries of control warring with a father's desperate, aching hope. He did not sleep that night. The East Tower had once been Queen Seraphine's sanctuary, a place of books and starlight, where she'd spent long nights studying texts forbidden to mortals. Now it served as Adriana's gilded cage. She stood at the narrow window, watching moonlight paint silver across the distant forest. Her fingers moved unconsciously through the gestures she'd taught Lilith, muscle memory whispering what her voice could not speak aloud. Home, hope, hidden. Behind her, a single candle flickered on the writing desk, the only furnishing besides a bed and chair. They'd allowed her nothing else. No scrolls, no ink, nothing that might hint at who she truly was. But they were too late for that. Her mind drifted backward, through the carefully constructed walls of her new identity, into the shadows of a life she'd buried 3 years ago. 7 years earlier, the Royal Library of Castle Noctis had been alive with whispered debate. Lady Adriana Valamont, 24, brilliant, and dangerously idealistic, stood before Queen Seraphine's private council, presenting her life's work. The Silent Code, she'd called it, unfurling scrolls across the marble table, a language that bridges human sign and vampiric ritual gesture, a system of communication that honors both our species, that allows those born without voice, or those who choose silence, to speak with the same dignity as any noble. The illustrations were exquisite, hands forming words, bodies expressing concepts, faces conveying emotion. Each gesture meticulously documented, each meaning layered with cultural significance from both worlds. Queen Seraphine, radiant even in the final months of her pregnancy, had leaned forward, wonder brightening her human eyes. "It's extraordinary, Adriana. Truly revolutionary. It could change everything, Your Majesty," Adriana had replied, passion trembling in her voice. "Imagine a court where silence is not a curse but a choice, where the mute are not pitied but heard, where humans and vampires communicate as equals." But Lord Cassius, the High Court's eldest advisor, had risen with cold fury etched into his ancient features. "This is heresy. You would pollute our sacred gestures, rituals passed down through millennia, with human sentimentality. I would honor them," Adriana had countered, "by making them accessible, by proving that communication transcends species. You would dilute our power." Cassius slammed his hand against the table. "The ritual gestures are ours alone, symbols of dominance, of divine right. To teach them to humans, to the voiceless, is to strip them of meaning." Queen Seraphine had intervened, her voice firm despite her delicate condition. "Lord Cassius, my daughter will be born half-human. If she inherits my mortality, she may never speak as vampires do. Would you deny her a voice simply because of her blood?" The chamber had fallen deathly silent. "Your Majesty," Cassius had said slowly, venomously, "we pray daily that the princess will be spared such afflictions. But should fate be unkind, there are other solutions. Discretion, privacy. The royal line need not be embarrassed by—" "Enough!" Seraphine's command had cracked like thunder. "Lady Valamont's work will be preserved. And should my daughter need it, she will learn." But the queen had died 3 months later in childbirth, and Princess Lilith had been born deaf. Adriana's hand stilled at the window, grief tightening her throat even after all these years. Within weeks of Seraphine's death, the High Court had moved swiftly. Her silent code was declared blasphemous, her scrolls burned, her name struck from the royal registry. Lord Cassius himself had delivered the decree. "You are no longer Lady Valamont. You are no longer welcome in this court. Leave Castle Noctis, or face execution for crimes against our sacred traditions." She'd fled that very night, vanishing into the network of human villages beyond the vampire territories. For 3 years, she'd lived in shadow. Different names, different faces, always moving, until she heard that King Draven had dismissed the last of Princess Lilith's tutors, that the child lived in isolation, unable to communicate, trapped in silence while the court pretended she didn't exist. Seraphine's daughter. The bridge between worlds the queen had died bringing into existence. Adriana had returned to Castle Noctis disguised as a simple maid named Adriana Charles. No noble lineage, no academic credentials, nothing to draw suspicion. Just another human servant grateful for work, and she'd waited, watched, until the moment came when she could give Lilith what her mother had dreamed of, a voice. Back in the present, Adriana pressed her forehead against the cold window glass. She'd known this day would come, the day her past caught up with her carefully constructed lie, but she'd hoped for more time. Enough to teach Lilith not just gestures but confidence. Enough to prove the silent code worked. Enough to honor Seraphine's memory. A key turned in the lock behind her. She turned slowly, expecting guards. Instead, a hooded figure slipped inside, closing the door with practiced silence. "You shouldn't be here," Adriana said quietly. The figure lowered their hood, revealing Elena, one of the castle's older servants, a woman who'd served Queen Seraphine personally. "Neither should you," Elena whispered urgently. "But we make our choices." She pressed a small cloth bundle into Adriana's hands. "There's talk, my lady. The king has ordered an investigation. His spy master is already digging through records, questioning merchants in the outer villages." Adriana's blood turned cold. "How long do I have?" "Days. Maybe less if they find the right informant." Elena's weathered face creased with worry. "You need to leave. Tonight I can arrange—" "No." Adriana's voice was firm. "I won't abandon Lilith. Not when she's finally learning to speak. They'll discover who you are. And when they do, Cassius will demand your execution. Let him." Adriana met Elena's eyes with quiet defiance. "Seraphine asked me to give her daughter a voice. I intend to keep that promise, whatever the cost." Elena shook her head, but there was pride in her expression. "You're as stubborn as the queen was. I learned from the best." Meanwhile, in the king's private study, Draven faced his steward across a desk cluttered with reports and grievances. "The court is restless, your majesty," the steward said carefully. "Rumors spread about the maid, about your decision to spare her. Some whisper you've grown soft. Others claim she's bewitched you." Draven's expression remained carved from ice. "Let them whisper. Lord Cassius has requested an audience. He wishes to discuss matters of royal propriety and succession." The steward's tone made clear what that meant. An attack disguised as concern. "Denied. Your Majesty, with respect, the longer the maid remains in the castle, the more questions arise. Questions about your judgment, your priorities." Draven's crimson eyes lifted, pinning the steward with lethal focus. "My priorities are none of the court's concern." The steward bowed stiffly and retreated. Alone, Draven pulled a hidden cord, and a section of the wall slid open. From the shadows emerged Severin, his spy master, a vampire so ancient and silent he seemed made of smoke. "Report," Draven commanded. "Adriana Charles does not exist, my king. No birth records, no family, no history before 3 years ago." Severin's voice was a whisper of silk and poison. "But there are rumors. A noblewoman who vanished after Queen Seraphine's death. A scholar who created something the High Court deemed heretical." Draven's hand slowly curled into a fist. "A name." Severin's smile was thin and knowing. "Lady Adriana Valamont, creator of the Silent Code, condemned by Lord Cassius himself." The pieces fell into place like shards of a shattered mirror reforming. The precision of her teaching, the academic methods, the way she'd spoken of his wife with intimate knowledge. She hadn't just known Seraphine. She'd served her. "Find me everything," Draven said quietly, dangerously. "Every scroll, every witness, every word of her trial. I want the truth." "And when you have it, your majesty?" Severin asked. "What then?" Draven stared into the darkness beyond his window, where the east tower rose like a pale finger against the night sky. "Then I will decide," he said softly, "whether she is my enemy or my salvation." The queen's library had been sealed since Seraphine's death. Draven stood before its ornate doors, carved oak inlaid with silver roses, now tarnished by years of neglect. Dust motes danced in the moonlight filtering through stained glass above. His hand hesitated on the handle, centuries of grief pressing against his ribs like a physical weight. He hadn't entered this room in 7 years. Hadn't been able to face the ghost of her presence lingering in every book she'd touched, every chair she'd sat in, every window she'd gazed through while dreaming of a better world. But tonight, he needed answers. And answers, he suspected, waited in the shadows of her memory. The door opened with a groan of forgotten hinges. The scent hit him first. Old parchment, dried lavender, and beneath it all, the faintest whisper of her perfume. His chest constricted. The room looked frozen in time. Books still open on reading tables. A shawl draped over a chair's arm. Teacups long dry but never cleared away. It was a mausoleum of love. Draven moved through the space like a man walking through water, each step heavy with recollection. There, the window seat where Seraphine had spent countless afternoons, sunlight warming her dark hair as she read. There, the desk where she'd written letters to human scholars, building bridges his court had desperately wanted to burn. His fingers trailed across the desk's surface, disturbing 7 years of dust. And there, tucked beneath a stack of diplomatic correspondence, he found it. A leather-bound journal, unmarked and unassuming. Draven opened it carefully, as though it might dissolve at his touch. The first page bore Seraphine's elegant handwriting, project undertaken with Lady Adriana Valamont. A new language for a new world. His breath stilled. Page after page unfolded before him. Sketches of hands forming gestures. Annotations in 2 different scripts. Seraphine's flowing cursive and another, more precise hand he now recognized as Adriana's. Notes on combining vampire ritual with human sign language. The silent code. In its earliest form, raw and revolutionary. Adriana believes communication is the foundation of empathy, Seraphine had written. If we can teach our peoples to speak the same language, even in silence, perhaps we can finally bridge the chasm between us. I pray our daughter will inherit this gift, that she will be the living proof that 2 worlds can exist as one. Further down the page, in Adriana's precise script, Her Majesty dreams of a court where silence is not exile but expression, where her child, regardless of voice or species, can stand before the throne and be heard. I will dedicate my life to making this dream reality. Draven sank into Seraphine's chair, the journal trembling in his hands. They had planned this together. The queen and her protégé, 2 women who dared imagine a future where his daughter wouldn't be hidden away in shame, but celebrated as the bridge between vampire and human, and he'd destroyed it. Allowed Cassius and the High Court to burn their work, exile their hope, and condemn his own daughter to the very silence they'd fought to break. A sound escaped his throat, half growl, half sob. Raw and ancient and entirely too human. Seraphine, he whispered to the empty room, forgive me, but the library offered no absolution, only echoes. In the East Tower, Lilith had found a way past her guards. It wasn't escape exactly, just a young princess's stubborn insistence on retrieving her sketchbook from her chambers, delivered by a sympathetic servant who couldn't refuse those pleading eyes. Now, confined to the tower with Adriana, Lilith sat cross-legged on the floor, charcoal in hand, drawing with fierce concentration. Adriana watched from her chair, a soft smile playing at her lips. What are you creating, princess? Lilith looked up and signed. A story. Her hands moved with growing confidence through the gestures Adriana had taught her, no longer hesitant, but purposeful, alive with meaning. Once upon a time, she signed, a girl lived in a castle of silence. She pointed to her drawing, a small figure in a tower, surrounded by walls of shadow. No one could hear her. She was alone. Adriana's throat tightened. And then, Lilith's face brightened. Her hands danced through the air with increasing speed. Then a teacher came. She taught the girl a magic language. And suddenly, she flipped the page, revealing a new drawing. The same girl, now surrounded by flowing ribbons of gesture and light. No longer trapped, but dancing. The girl could speak to the stars. Tears pricked Adriana's eyes. It's beautiful, Lilith. The princess beamed and signed back. Will you teach me more? Please? Always, Adriana promised, her voice thick with emotion. For as long as they allow me. Lilith frowned, then signed slowly, carefully. Father is afraid. Of what, darling? Of losing me, like he lost Mother. The wisdom in those small hands broke Adriana's heart. Your father loves you very much, she said gently. Sometimes love looks like walls. But I think perhaps he's beginning to see they were never meant to protect you, only to cage you both. Draven found them that way an hour later. He'd left the Queen's library with the journal clutched against his chest, intending to confront Adriana with the truth, to demand explanations, to rage against her deception. But when he reached the tower door and peered through the gap, all his fury evaporated like morning mist. Lilith sat at Adriana's feet, signing a story while the former Lady Valamont watched with the tenderness of a mother. His daughter's face glowed with concentration, with pride, emotions he'd thought lost to her forever. She signed something, and Adriana laughed, a sound like bells, achingly reminiscent of Seraphine's own laughter. Then Lilith signed again, and this time Draven understood the gesture. Happy. His daughter was telling Adriana she was happy. Something cracked inside. Draven's chest, some ancient wall he'd built around his heart after Seraphine died. The grief didn't disappear, but for the first time in 7 years, it made room for something else. Hope. He watched them a moment longer, then quietly withdrew, leaving the door ajar. In his study, he placed Seraphine's journal on his desk beside the reports from his spymaster, Lady Adriana Valamont, heretic, exile, his wife's chosen protégé, the woman who'd risked everything to honor a dead. Queen's dream, the woman who'd given his daughter back her voice. Draven's hand hovered over the execution order Cassius had already drafted, waiting only for his signature. Instead, he pushed it aside, and for the first time since becoming king, he allowed himself to imagine a different kind of justice, one that looked less like punishment and more like redemption, one that Seraphine would have chosen. His fingers trembled slightly as he locked the journal in his desk drawer, not to hide it, but to protect it. "I'm beginning to understand," he whispered to the memory of his wife. "Forgive me for taking so long." Outside, dawn approached, and with it, the beginning of change. Word spread through Castle Noctis like fire through parchment. The deaf princess was speaking, not with voice, but with hands that moved like poetry. Servants whispered in corridors. Guards exchanged glances during their watch. And in the perfumed salons where noble vampires gathered to feast and gossip, Lilith's transformation became the subject of heated debate. "They say the child performs entire conversations now," Lady Morgana remarked, swirling blood wine in her crystal goblet. "That she signs greetings, tells stories, even argues with her tutors. A miracle," breathed one courtier. "A curse," hissed another. "Human gestures polluting royal blood." Lord Cassius, seated at the head of the salon, said nothing, but his ancient eyes gleamed with cold calculation. It was only a matter of time before the powder keg ignited. The explosion came 3 days later in the castle's grand corridor. Lilith walked beside 2 guards, returning from her morning lessons, when she encountered Lady Isadora, a noblewoman whose family had served the high court for centuries. The woman's lip curled as the princess approached. "So it's true," Isadora said loudly, her voice carrying down the marble hall. "The king allows his daughter to be taught by a human servant. How the mighty Nightfall line has fallen." Lilith stopped, her small hands clenching at her sides. "She teaches the child peasant gestures," Isadora continued, addressing the gathering courtiers with theatrical disdain. "Dilutes centuries of pure vampire heritage with common human sentimentality. The late queen would be ashamed." The words struck like a blade. Lilith's face flushed crimson. Her hands rose, trembling at first, then steady, and she signed with precise, deliberate fury. "My mother would be proud." The corridor fell silent. Isadora blinked, clearly not expecting a response. "What is she doing?" "My teacher honors my mother's memory," Lilith signed, her small frame radiating defiance. "She gives me what you never could. A voice." One of the guards translated quietly, his voice hushed with awe. Isadora's face twisted. "This is exactly what I mean. The child performs like a trained—" "I am a princess," Lilith signed, cutting her off. Her hands moved with the regal precision Adriana had taught her. "I am my mother's daughter, and I will not be silenced by your fear." Gasps rippled through the assembled nobles, and from the shadowed archway behind them, Draven emerged. He'd watched the entire exchange, his expression unreadable as carved marble. Now he moved forward with predatory grace, and the crowd parted like water before a storm. "Lady Isadora," he said softly, a tone far more dangerous than shouting, "you will apologize to my daughter. Now." The noblewoman paled, her haughty composure crumbling. "Your Majesty, I only meant to express concern for—" "You meant to insult both my child and her teacher." Draven's crimson eyes blazed. "You invoke my wife's name while dishonoring her memory." Seraphine believed in bridges, not barriers, in voices, not silence. He placed a hand on Lilith's shoulder, a gesture of unmistakable support. "My daughter's language is not a curse. It is a gift, and anyone who cannot see that has no place in this court." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Isadora sank into a curtsy so deep it bordered on prostration. "Forgive me, Your Majesty." "Princess Lilith." Draven dismissed her with a wave, then knelt before his daughter. Lilith's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her chin remained high. "Thank you," she signed to him. His response was clumsy, unpracticed, but unmistakable. He signed back, "Always." That night, Draven stood outside Adriana's tower door longer than he cared to admit. He shouldn't be here. A king didn't visit imprisoned servants in the dead of night. It was improper, dangerous, and would fuel exactly the kind of gossip that already threatened his authority. But he knocked anyway. Adriana opened the door, surprise flickering across her face before settling into calm acceptance. She wore a simple white shift, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. In the candlelight, she looked less like a maid and more like the noblewoman she'd once been. "Your Majesty," she said quietly. Stepping aside, Draven entered, and she closed the door behind him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The tension between them hummed like a drawn bowstring. "Lilith defended you today," he finally said, his back to her. "Against Lady Isadora, in front of half the court. I heard." Adriana's voice was soft. "She shouldn't have had to." "No." He turned to face her, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her breath catch. But she chose to. Do you understand what that means? She found her voice, her power, because of you, because of your wife, Adriana corrected gently. I only continued what Seraphine began. You risked everything. His voice rose, frustration bleeding through his composure. Your safety, your life. You returned to a court that condemned you, hid under a false name, knowing discovery meant execution. Why? He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, towering over her. Why would you do this for a child you barely know? Adriana met his gaze without flinching, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Because she is more than your heir, Draven. The use of his name, no title, no formality, struck them both. She is her mother's promise, the bridge between our worlds, the proof that love transcends blood and species and all the petty prejudices that divide us. Her voice cracked slightly. Seraphine died bringing that promise into the world. How could I let it die in silence? Draven's composure shattered. She's gone, Adriana. My wife is gone and I couldn't save her. Couldn't protect her from her own mortality. And now you ask me to, what? To trust? To hope? When hope is the cruelest torture of all. I ask you to see your daughter, Adriana said fiercely, stepping closer until barely a breath separated them. Not as a reminder of what you lost, but as evidence of what you still have. Lilith is extraordinary, brilliant, kind. She deserves better than a father who keeps her locked away out of fear. I am not afraid. You're terrified. Her hand rose, hovering near his chest as if to touch him but not quite daring. You're terrified of loving her fully because you already lost one person you couldn't live without. But Draven, her voice softened to a whisper, she's already here. She's already yours. And she needs you to be brave enough to let her be. His hand caught hers before she could pull away, pressing her palm flat against his chest where, impossibly, his dead heart seemed to stir. You speak of bravery, he said hoarsely. But you're the one who walked back into the lion's den, who stands before me now without fear, though I could end your life with a thought. I'm not unafraid, Adriana admitted. I'm simply certain. Some things are worth dying for. And if I don't want you to die, the words escaped before he could stop them. Raw and devastating. The air between them crackled with something dangerous. Forbidden. Adriana's breath hitched. Then perhaps, Your Majesty, you should consider setting me free. But they both knew she wasn't talking about the tower. Draven released her hand abruptly, stepping back as if burned. This cannot. We cannot. I know, she whispered. They stood in the charged silence, the weight of duty and desire crushing them both. Finally, Draven moved toward the door. He paused at the threshold, his voice barely audible. You're right. About all of it. Then he was gone, leaving Adriana alone with her racing heart, and the ghost of his touch still burning against her skin. The High Council convened at dawn, an ominous hour when even the strongest vampires felt the pull of daylight pressing against their immortal bones. Draven sat at the head of the obsidian table, his expression carved from stone as 12 ancient nobles filed into the chamber. Lord Cassius entered last, moving with the deliberate pace of a predator who'd already cornered its prey. Your Majesty, Cassius began, his voice dripping with false concern. We gather on a matter of grave importance. A matter of treason. Draven's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Cassius placed a weathered document on the table, a servant registry from 7 years past. The maid you've housed in the East Tower, Adriana Charles. He paused, letting the name hang in the air like poison. She does not exist. Murmurs rippled through the council. However, Lady Adriana Valamont, condemned heretic, enemy of the High Court, does exist. And she bears a remarkable resemblance to your current guest. Cassius unfurled a second document. A trial record, ink faded but damning. Beside it, a portrait painted during Queen Seraphine's reign. The woman in the image was younger, dressed in noble finery, but unmistakably Adriana. She infiltrated your household under false pretenses, Cassius continued, his ancient eyes gleaming. Defied royal decree, corrupted the princess with forbidden knowledge. By our laws, these crimes carry one penalty. He looked directly at Draven. Death. The council erupted in agreement. She must be executed, Lady Morgana declared. To show mercy would be to appear weak. The human servant has made a mockery of our traditions, another noble added. Of you, Your Majesty. Draven's fingers curled against the armrest of his chair, his silence more terrifying than any outburst. Lord Cassius leaned forward. You hesitate, my king. Why? Surely you understand that protecting a condemned criminal, a human no less, defies centuries of vampire law. It threatens the very foundation of your authority. Does it? Draven's voice was soft, lethal. Or does it threaten your authority, Cassius? Your ability to control this court through fear and rigid tradition? Cassius's expression hardened. I serve the crown, as I have for 800 years. But even kings are not above the law. If you refuse to pass judgment, the council has the right to act independently. It was a coup wrapped in legal pretense, a challenge to Draven's sovereignty disguised as loyalty. You would execute her without my consent, Draven asked dangerously. We would enforce the law your mercy has stayed. Cassius's smile was thin and cold. Unless, of course, you believe one human woman is worth fracturing this court. Worth risking civil war among your nobles? The trap closed around him. Protect Adriana and watch his kingdom splinter. Condemn her and destroy the only person who'd given his daughter hope. Authority versus love. Law versus justice. Draven had faced armies, conquered territories, ruled for centuries with absolute control. But in this moment, he felt powerless. I will consider the council's recommendation, he said finally, each word like broken glass. You will have my decision by nightfall. What none of them knew was that a small figure crouched behind the heavy velvet curtains at the chamber's edge. Lilith had followed her father that morning, slipping past distracted guards, desperate to understand why he'd seemed so troubled. She'd hidden herself in the alcove just before the council began, and now she pressed her hands over her mouth to keep from making a sound. They wanted to kill Adriana, her teacher, her friend, the only person besides her father who'd ever truly seen her, and Draven, her strong, unshakable father, didn't know how to save her. Tears streamed silently down Lilith's face as she watched him stand and dismiss the council, his shoulders bearing the weight of an impossible choice. She waited until the chamber emptied, then slipped away like a ghost. That night, Lilith locked herself in her room. Her hands shook as she gathered her painting supplies. Pigments her mother had once used, brushes worn soft with age. She moved her small desk aside and knelt before the stone wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Then she began to paint. The gestures of the silent code flowed from her fingers onto the wall in bold, desperate strokes. Not a story this time. Not a lesson or a practice, a plea. She painted the sign for please again and again, each repetition larger and more urgent than the last, until the entire wall blazed with her silent cry, please, please, please. Her hands cramped. Tears blurred her vision, but she didn't stop until every inch of stone carried her message, a prayer in a language only 3 people in the castle understood. When she finished, she collapsed against the wall, her small body racked with sobs that made no sound. Draven came to check on her an hour later. He'd spent the evening in his study, staring at execution orders and legal precedents, searching for a loophole that didn't exist. His mind churned with impossible calculations. Sacrifice Adriana to maintain order, or protect her, and watch his kingdom descend into chaos. He knocked softly on Lilith's door. When she didn't answer, he entered anyway, concerned. The room was dark except for moonlight streaming through the window. Lilith lay curled on her bed, her back to him, shoulders still trembling. Lilith? He called gently. She didn't respond. He moved closer, intending to wake her. When his gaze fell on the wall, his breath stopped. Please, 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 please. The word covered the entire surface, painted in a dozen shades of desperate hope. Some strokes were bold and clear, others smudged with tears. His daughter had painted her heart onto stone, had begged him in the only language she had, and he understood every word. Draven's knees buckled. He sank to the floor beside his daughter's bed, centuries of iron control finally shattering. A sound escaped his throat, raw and broken and utterly human. Forgive me, he whispered, his voice cracking. Forgive me, Lilith. Forgive me, Seraphine. He'd failed them both. Built walls instead of bridges, chosen fear over love. Let laws written by dead tyrants dictate the fate of his living, breathing daughter. No more. Draven pressed his forehead against his daughter's wall, his hand tracing the painted plea. When he stood minutes later, his eyes were dry but blazing with terrible purpose. He strode from the room with the bearing of a king who'd finally remembered what he was fighting for. Not a kingdom of stone and shadow, but a little girl who deserved to be heard, and he would burn his entire court to ash before letting them silence her. Again, the throne room blazed with torchlight and fury. Every noble family in the vampire territories had gathered for the spectacle, witnesses to what Lord Cassius called the restoration of order. They filled the marble hall in their finery, silk and velvet in shades of blood and midnight, jewels glittering like captured stars. The air hummed with anticipation, the electric charge that always preceded an execution. At the chamber's center, a raised platform had been erected. Iron chains hung from posts driven into the stone, and bound within those chains stood Adriana, Valamont. They'd stripped away her servant's dress and replaced it with prisoners. Gray, a deliberate humiliation, Her wrists were shackled, her dark hair loose and tangled. But her spine remained straight, her head unbowed. Even in chains, she carried herself with the dignity of the noblewoman she'd once been. The crowd pressed closer, eager for blood. "Lady Adriana Vallemont!" Lord Cassius's voice boomed through the hall. "You stand accused of sedition, heresy, and crimes against the vampire crown. How do you answer?" Adriana lifted her chin. "I taught a child to speak. If that is sedition, then your laws are tyranny." Gasps and hisses erupted. Several nobles lunged forward only to be restrained by guards. "She admits it," Lady Morgana shrieked. "She admits defying the High Court's decree." A priest in crimson robes stepped forward, his ancient face twisted with disgust. "The silent code is blasphemy, a corruption of our sacred rituals. This woman sought to pollute our divine language with human weakness. She must be purged. Death!" Someone shouted, "Burn her!" Another voice cried. The chant built like thunder. "Death! Death! Death!" Adriana stood motionless amid the storm, her expression serene. She'd known this moment would come, had accepted it the day she returned to Castle Noctis. Some things were worth dying for. At the far end of the hall, elevated on his throne, Draven watched in silence. His face was an impassive mask, the perfect image of royal detachment, but his hands gripped the armrests with such force the ancient wood creaked. Lord Cassius turned to him with theatrical reverence. "Your Majesty, the evidence is clear. The accused does not deny her crimes. By the laws of our ancestors, she must face execution at sunset." He paused. "Unless you have reason to grant mercy?" It was a trap. Every noble in the room watched, waiting to see if their king would choose a human servant over centuries of tradition. Draven's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to speak. The throne room doors burst open. Every head turned as Princess Lilith entered. She wore her mother's gown, ruby red silk that had been carefully preserved, now altered to fit her small frame. Her pale hair was crowned with a simple silver circlet. She moved with slow, deliberate grace down the center aisle, her chin high, her expression fearless. Behind her trailed two shocked guards who'd clearly failed to stop her. "Princess Lilith," Cassius began, his voice strained with false gentility. "This is not a place for children." Lilith walked past him as if he didn't exist. The crowd parted before her like water, too stunned to react. She crossed the marble floor with the bearing of a queen, climbed the steps to the platform, and stood directly before the throne, facing her father, the court, and destiny. Then she began to sign. Her hands moved with exquisite precision through the gestures of royal greeting. Each motion was flawless, elegant, imbued with centuries of tradition, yet expressed in the silent code. "I am Princess Lilith Nightfall," she signed, her small hands painting meaning in the air. "Daughter of Draven and Seraphine, heir to the throne of shadows and light." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Some nobles understood fragments of the gestures from ancient ritual. Others simply recognized the unmistakable grace of royalty. Lilith continued, her face radiant with purpose. "I stand before you not in weakness, but in strength. Not in silence, but in speech. I am deaf, yet I am heard. I am half human, yet I am royal. I am my mother's daughter." Tears streamed down more than one courtier's face. Even those who'd called for Adriana's death stood transfixed. "This language is not corruption," Lilith signed. "It is complete. It honors both my bloodlines, both my peoples." She turned then, slowly, to face Adriana. The hall held its breath. Lilith raised her hands and signed one word with devastating simplicity. "Teacher." Then she bowed, the perfect curtsy of a princess honoring her superior. The throne room erupted in chaos. Shouts of approval clashed with cries of outrage. Nobles argued with each other while priests clutched their holy symbols in horror. The carefully orchestrated execution had become something else entirely, a revolution. Draven rose from his throne. The room fell instantly silent. He descended the steps with predatory grace, every eye following his movement. When he reached the platform, he stood between his daughter and the chained woman who'd taught her to speak. For a long moment, he simply looked at them. Lilith, brave and brilliant, everything Seraphine had dreamed of. Adriana, condemned yet unbroken, the keeper of his wife's legacy. Then Draven's mask cracked. It happened slowly, like ice fracturing across a frozen lake. The centuries of control, the carefully maintained detachment, the iron facade of kingship, all of it shattered. What remained was a father who'd finally learned to see. He turned to face his court, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You call this blasphemy. I call it mercy." He gestured to Lilith. "You see corruption. I see my daughter, whole, expressive, alive for the first time since her mother's death." His crimson eyes blazed. "Lady Vallemont did not commit sedition. She honored a queen's dying wish. She gave voice to the voiceless. She built the bridge my wife died believing in. Lord Cassius stepped forward, his ancient face mottled with rage. Your Majesty, you cannot— I can. Draven's voice dropped to lethal softness. I am king, and I say this trial ends now. He reached up and tore the chains from the posts with his bare hands, a casual display of the raw power that had made him legend. Adriana stumbled slightly as the shackles fell away. Lilith immediately steadied her, their hands clasping tight. Draven faced his court one final time. If my daughter's silence was weakness, he declared, then perhaps this kingdom has been deaf for far too long. The words echoed through the hall like a death knell for the old order, and in that moment, everything changed. Silence gripped the throne room like a fist around a throat. Draven stood at the center of the platform, the broken chains still dangling from his hands, his daughter on one side and the woman he'd just freed on the other. The court stared in collective shock, centuries of certainty crumbling beneath their feet. Lord Cassius recovered first, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. Your Majesty, this is madness. You cannot? Draven's voice cut through the chamber like a blade drawn from its sheath. He dropped the chains and they hit the marble with a deafening clang that echoed through the stunned silence. I am king of the Nightfall dynasty, sovereign of these territories, heir to 8 centuries of unbroken rule. He stepped forward, and even the oldest nobles recoiled. Tell me, Cassius, what exactly can I not do? The ancient vampire's mouth worked soundlessly. Draven ascended the steps to his throne but didn't sit. Instead, he turned to face the assembled court, backlit by torchlight, looking every inch the warrior king who'd once conquered kingdoms. For too long, this court has confused tradition with truth, law with justice. We've hidden behind ancient decrees written by vampires who never imagined a world where our kind might share power, share knowledge, share understanding with those we deemed lesser. His voice built like gathering thunder. My wife saw that world. She died bringing it into existence. And his voice cracked just slightly. I was too blind with grief to honor her sacrifice. He gestured to Lilith, who stood tall beside Adriana, her small hand still clasped in her teacher's. My daughter is deaf, half human, born of 2 worlds that this court insists cannot coexist. For 7 years, I watched her fade into silence because I was too afraid, too proud, to admit that our traditions had failed her. His crimson eyes swept across the room, holding each noble's gaze in turn. But one woman refused to accept that failure. One woman risked execution to give my daughter what we should have offered freely. A voice. It's heresy. A priest shouted from the crowd. No! Draven's voice dropped to lethal quiet. Heresy is condemning a child to isolation because we're too rigid to evolve. Heresy is burning knowledge because it challenges our comfort. Heresy is calling mercy weakness and cruelty strength. He descended from the throne, moving to stand beside Adriana. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, her composure finally breaking. Lady Adriana Valamont. His voice rang with formal authority. You are hereby pardoned of all charges. Your exile has ended. Your title is restored. He paused, then added with quiet intensity. And your work, the Silent Code, is proclaimed an official language of the Nightfall Court. Shock detonated through the chamber. From this day forward, Draven continued over the rising tumult, the Silent Code will be taught alongside our traditional tongues. Any citizen, vampire or human, noble or servant, voiced or voiceless, may learn it, speak it, and be heard in it. His gaze found Lord Cassius. Any who oppose this decree oppose their king. Choose your allegiance carefully. It was a revolution wrapped in royal command. A complete dismantling of the social order that had governed vampire society for millennia. Lady Morgana found her voice first, though it trembled. Your Majesty, surely you see this will divide the kingdom. The old families will adapt or abdicate. Draven's words were final as a tomb ceiling. I will not sacrifice my daughter's future to preserve your past. Adriana sank to her knees, overwhelmed. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. 7 years of fear, exile, and desperate hope finally releasing. She pressed her forehead to the cold marble, unable to speak, unable to do anything but weep. Lilith rushed forward, but not to Adriana. She ran to her father, throwing her small arms around his waist. Draven caught her instinctively, lifting her into his embrace as she signed frantically against his chest. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Her hands repeated the gesture over and over, each repetition more fervent than the last. Then she pulled back and signed with trembling fingers. I love you, Father. Draven's breath caught. His eyes, ancient and weary and filled with centuries of carefully buried emotion, finally spilled over. A single tear traced down his pale cheek, glinting like liquid silver in the torchlight. He signed back clumsily, his movements unpracticed but unmistakable. I love you. A sound rippled through the throne room, part gasp, part sob. Several nobles openly wept. Even the guards looked away, unable to maintain their stoic masks. The king had shown weakness, had chosen love over law, had placed his daughter's happiness above political stability, and somehow, it made him stronger. Draven set Lilith down gently and turned back to the court, his voice rough but steady. The Nightfall dynasty was built on conquest, on domination, on the belief that power meant crushing those beneath us. He looked at his daughter, then at Adriana still kneeling on the floor. But my wife taught me another truth before she died. Real power isn't silencing others. It's helping them find their voice. He extended his hand to Adriana. She stared at it for a heartbeat, then placed her hand in his. He lifted her to her feet with gentle strength, their eyes meeting in a moment of profound understanding. Lady Valamont, he said formally, though his voice carried warmth, you will serve as royal educator and keeper of the silent code. You will train teachers, establish schools, and ensure that no child in this kingdom, vampire or human, ever suffers the isolation my daughter endured. Adriana's voice finally returned, thick with emotion. It would be my honor, Your Majesty. Draven addressed the court one final time. The trial is concluded. The decree is law. Any who cannot accept this new order may leave my service with honor, but those who remain will help me build the kingdom my wife envisioned. A kingdom where silence is not exile, but simply another way to speak. He placed one hand on Lilith's shoulder and extended the other toward Adriana, a symbolic bridge between them. This is the rebirth of the Nightfall dynasty, not weaker, stronger, not diminished, complete. The throne room remained suspended in stunned silence for one more heartbeat. Then, slowly, tentatively, a young vampire noble near the back began to applaud. Another joined. Then another. The sound built gradually, not overwhelming, not universal, but enough. Enough to signal that change, however terrifying, had finally come to Castle Noctis. Lord Cassius stood rigid as stone, his ancient face a mask of barely contained rage. But even he recognized defeat when it wore a crown. The old order had fallen, and from its ashes, something new, something revolutionary, had been born. Spring came to Castle Noctis for the first time in living memory, not the season itself, that had always turned with celestial precision, but the feeling of spring, renewal, growth, the sense that frozen things might finally thaw. Months had passed since the trial, and the castle had transformed. Where once silence meant isolation, it now meant inclusion. Where shadows had symbolized secrets, they now danced with the graceful movements of a new language. The grand courtyard, previously reserved for military drills and formal ceremonies, now hosted something unprecedented. Children at play, vampire and human children, noble and servant-born, sat in circles on the manicured lawn. Their teacher, a young vampire woman trained by Adriana herself, demonstrated gestures while they practiced with eager concentration. Friend, she signed, and 30 small hands echoed the movement. Joy. Together. From a balcony above, Adriana watched with quiet satisfaction. She wore deep blue silk now, embroidered with silver threads that caught the light, the formal robes of her new position. Her hair was crowned with a simple circlet marking her status, Lady of Words, Royal Educator of the Nightfall Dynasty, Keeper of the Silent Code, titles that once would have been impossible, honors that redefined what power meant in this ancient kingdom. The Royal Academy of Silent Speech occupied the entire West Wing now, classrooms filled with students of all ages, libraries stocked with illustrated texts, workshops where teachers learned to bridge worlds through gesture and grace. What had begun as one maid teaching one princess had blossomed into an institution that would outlive them all. Impressive, isn't it? Adriana turned to find Draven approaching along the colonnade. He moved differently now, less like a predator, more like a man. The perpetual tension that had carved his features into marble had softened, replaced by something gentler, something that looked almost like peace. Your Majesty, she greeted with a slight bow. Adriana. He joined her at the balcony rail, watching the children below. You've built something extraordinary. We've built it, she corrected gently. This wouldn't exist without your decree, your courage to change. My stubbornness nearly prevented it entirely. His voice carried old regret. I should thank you for being more persistent than I was foolish. She smiled. Persistence is a polite word for it. I believe Lord Cassius used insufferable defiance. Draven's lips twitched, the closest he came to a smile these days. He's retired to his country estate. Claims the capital no longer suits his constitution. A diplomatic way of saying he can't bear watching tradition evolve. Indeed. Draven paused, then added quietly. Several families followed him. The old guard, unwilling to adapt. And the kingdom stands nonetheless. Stronger, perhaps. He turned to face her fully. You were right, Adriana. About all of it. Seraphine would be proud. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning that extended beyond professional respect. In the months since the trial, they'd maintained careful distance, appropriately formal, never quite crossing the invisible line between monarch and subject. But the way he looked at her now suggested that line was becoming harder to see. I should check on the afternoon class, Adriana said softly, not quite meeting his eyes. Lilith is demonstrating advanced etiquette gestures for the senior students. I know. Draven's voice carried warmth. I'm expected to attend. Apparently I'm the visiting dignitary she'll be practicing on. Adriana's smile widened. She's been preparing all week. You're in for quite the performance. They walked together through the castle corridors, now alive with activity. Servants signed greetings as they passed. Guards communicated silently across courtyards. In every corner, the silent code wove itself into the fabric of daily life. Revolution, it turned out, could be quiet. The royal study looked almost exactly as it had months ago. The same oak table, the same stained glass windows casting colored light across polished floors. But everything had changed. Lilith stood at the center of the room, no longer a child lost in silence, but a young princess radiating confidence. She wore crimson silk, her mother's color, and her pale hair was braided with silver ribbons. Around her sat 24 students, from young children to adult nobles, all watching with rapt attention. Adriana and Draven entered quietly, taking seats at the back. Lilith's face lit up when she saw her father, but she maintained her composure. This was a formal demonstration after all. She began with the basic gestures, explaining each movement to her students through sign. Her hands painted meaning in the air with the precision of a master calligrapher, each gesture flowing seamlessly into the next. Respect, honor, duty. Then she moved into more complex combinations. The formal greetings reserved for diplomatic encounters, the subtle signs that conveyed rank and relationship, the ancient gestures borrowed from vampire ritual, but transformed through her mother's human grace. It was breathtaking. Draven watched, transfixed, as his daughter performed the very traditions his court had once claimed she'd corrupted. But she hadn't corrupted anything. She'd perfected it, made it accessible without diminishing its power. Finally, Lilith gestured for her father to join her at the front of the room. He rose and crossed to stand before her, acutely aware of every eye watching. Princess and king, daughter and father, facing each other in the language that had once been forbidden. Lilith performed the full royal greeting, a complex sequence that took nearly a minute to complete. Every gesture was flawless, imbued with dignity and love in equal measure. When she finished, the room erupted in silent applause, hands raised and shaken in the gesture of appreciation. But Lilith wasn't done. She looked up at her father, her young face suddenly vulnerable, and signed a single question. Are you proud? The study fell utterly still. Draven's throat tightened. For centuries, he'd commanded armies with his voice, ruled kingdoms with his words. But now, when it mattered most, words felt inadequate. So he answered in her language. His hands moved slowly, carefully. He was still learning, still stumbling over the more complex gestures. But what he lacked in skill, he made up for in sincerity, more than words could ever say. Then he added, with trembling fingers that betrayed the depth of his emotion, You are my pride, my joy, my heart. Lilith launched herself into his arms with a child's unself-conscious love. He caught her, holding her close as she buried her face against his chest. Around them, students wiped away tears. Adriana pressed a hand to her mouth, her own eyes glistening. The afternoon sun shifted, sending new patterns of light through the stained glass windows. Red and gold and violet spilled across the floor, casting everything in warm radiance. And in that light, the shadows of father and daughter merged and overlapped, their joined silhouette forming, whether by accident or destiny, the sign for family. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Draven stood alone in Queen Seraphine's library. The room lived again, books organized, dust cleared away, candles burning softly in their holders. But he'd left one thing exactly as he'd found it months ago, her journal, open to the page where she'd written about the silent code. He traced his fingers over her handwriting, then over Adriana's notes beside it, 2 women who'd dared to dream of bridges, who'd believed that silence could be speech, that difference could be strength, that love was always worth the risk. I kept my promise, he whispered to his wife's memory. Our daughter has her voice, and she's using it to change the world. Outside, the sounds of the castle settling into evening drifted through the windows, not empty silence now, but the comfortable quiet of a place at peace. Somewhere, children laughed. Teachers prepared tomorrow's lessons. Guards signed their nightly reports. The kingdom Seraphine had envisioned was finally, slowly, becoming real. Draven closed the journal carefully and placed it on the shelf where it belonged, not hidden away, but preserved, honored, a testament to the woman who'd taught him that the strongest chains were the ones we placed on ourselves, and that breaking them was how we learned to fly. He extinguished the candles and left the library, leaving the door open behind him. No more sealed rooms, no more buried memories, only light and love, and the legacy of silence transformed into song. In the years that followed, the silent code spread throughout the vampire territories and beyond. The Royal Academy of Silent Speech became legendary, training ambassadors who carried the language to distant kingdoms. Princess Lilith grew into a queen who ruled with both voice and gesture, beloved by vampires and humans alike. And in the castle gardens, beneath a statue erected in Queen Seraphine's honor, 3 words were inscribed in the silent code: love, unity, voice. The legacy of a maid who dared to teach, a king who dared to change, and a princess who proved that silence was never the absence of power, only the beginning of a different kind of strength.